security team had promised Daniel Carter that it would take exactly 60 seconds to cut the power to the ballroom, but as he looked out at the sea of shimmering silk, he realized 60 seconds was a lifetime too late. He stood on the mahogany dais, the undisputed king of New York's elite, clutching a baccarat flute filled with vintage champagne. For 10 years, he had lived as the grieving widower, the pillar of strength who raised a daughter alone after a tragic accident. Now, as he prepared to deliver the final toast of Sophie's 21st birthday gala, he felt the lie settle into a permanent, untouchable truth. He cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone, unaware that the ghost he had manufactured was standing in the wings, her finger on the trigger of an unauthorized transmitter. "To my daughter, Sophie," Daniel began, his voice dropping into a practiced, gravelly register. He turned toward the left side of the stage, where Sophie sat in a gown of pale blue lace. She was his porcelain masterpiece, her eyes already brimming with tears. For a decade, he had pruned her memories, ensuring she remembered her mother only as a blurry, saintly figure lost to the sea. "You look so much like her tonight," he continued, his voice wavering with a calculated tremor. "Rebecca would have been so proud. She was taken from us far too soon, leaving a void that no amount of success could ever fill." A collective sigh rippled through the room. Daniel felt the surge of power that came with a perfect performance. He raised his glass higher. "To Rebecca, may her soul find the peace she never had in life." But the toast never reached his lips. A sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback tore through the room, silencing the applause before it could begin. Daniel's brow furrowed in a flash of catastrophic realization. He looked toward the sound booth, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. Then, a second sound followed, a rhythmic, haunting tap-tap-tap. It was the sound of a manicured fingernail striking a microphone mesh. "Peace is a luxury you never allowed me, Daniel," a voice whispered. The voice wasn't a recording. It was a rich, melodic contralto that sent a physical shockwave through the room, turning the air to ice. It was the voice of a woman declared dead in an Italian morgue 10 years ago. It was Rebecca. Daniel's face transformed. The smug widower vanished, replaced by a mask of pure panic. His mouth hung open, and the champagne began to tilt dangerously in his hand. He watched in horror as a cool, blinding spotlight cut through the darkness of the stage's right wing. Standing there, draped in silver silk that flowed like mercury, was the woman he had paid to disappear. She didn't look like a victim. She held a vintage silver microphone like a weapon, wearing a smirk that promised a total public dismantling. Sophie's glass shattered against the marble floor. "Mom," she breathed, the word pinning the betrayal to the wall for everyone to see. The power triangle was complete, the victim on the left, the chaos in the center, and the truth on the right. Daniel looked from his daughter to his wife, his world literally revolving around his failure. The champagne finally spilled, a golden spray coating his custom tuxedo, the precise moment his facade broke beyond repair. "I'm not a ghost, Daniel," Rebecca said, her voice slicing through the hushed crowd as she stepped into the light. "I'm just the woman who outlived your lies, and tonight, everyone is going to hear exactly what it cost to keep me quiet." As Rebecca took her first step toward the dais, the security team finally reached the breaker, but it was too late. The light had already been cast. The ballroom was no longer a party. It was a crime scene, and Daniel Carter was the only one under the knife. The great unmasking had begun, and as the deceased woman began to speak, the only question remaining was how many other lives Daniel had buried to build his throne. To the outside world, the Carter estate was a monument to architectural perfection, but to Sophie, it was a museum where she was the primary exhibit. Every hallway was a curated gallery of her father's grief, and every room was a reinforced cell of his protection. Growing up in the shadow of Daniel Carter didn't feel like being raised, it felt like being preserved. In the 10 years since her mother's supposed death, the house had become a sanctuary for a ghost, and Sophie had become the living vessel for a memory that was starting to feel more like a script. On the morning of the gala, hours before the toast of the century would dismantle their lives, Sophie stood in the center of her bedroom, her arms held out like a doll, as 3 stylists made final adjustments to her pale blue gown. The fabric was exquisite, French lace so delicate it felt like a second skin, but to Sophie, it felt like a uniform. Blue was her mother's favorite color. Or rather, blue was the color Daniel told her was her mother's favorite. Every choice Sophie made, from the perfume she wore to the charity she headed, was filtered through the lens of a dead woman's legacy. "Keep your chin up, Sophie," Daniel's voice boomed from the doorway. He stood there, leaning against the frame, a man whose presence filled every corner of the room. He wasn't just her father, he was the architect of her reality. "Your mother always held her head with such grace. People will be looking for her in you tonight. Don't disappoint them." "I won't, Dad," Sophie replied, her voice a practiced whisper of obedience. This was the golden cage, in its most literal sense. Her life was a series of expectations designed to honor a woman she could barely remember. According to Daniel, Rebecca Carter had been a saint, a woman of peerless virtue and silent devotion who had been snatched away by a cruel twist of fate on an Italian coastline. He told the story so often, with such cinematic detail, that Sophie had eventually replaced her own hazy, warm memories of a mother's laughter with her father's cold, polished anecdotes. The legend of the perfect deceased mother was the foundation upon which Daniel had built his empire. It made him the tragic hero of Manhattan, the man who lost his heart but kept his integrity. "The board of directors will be at table 4, Daniel said, stepping into the room and dismissing the stylists with a sharp flick of his wrist. He walked behind Sophie, looking at her reflection in the full-length mirror. He placed his heavy hands on her shoulders. "They need to see that you are stable, that we are stable. The Carter legacy depends on the world believing that we have turned our tragedy into triumph. Do you understand?" "I understand," Sophie said, though a cold shiver ran down her spine. The pressure was a physical weight. She felt as though she were walking on a tightrope stretched over a canyon of her father's expectations. If she slipped, if she showed a moment of genuine, unscripted emotion, the entire structure would collapse. Daniel squeezed her shoulders, a gesture that was supposed to be affectionate but felt like a warning. "Good. You are the face of this family, Sophie. My strength is your strength. We are all that's left of her." He left her then, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the silence of the room. Sophie looked at her reflection. The shattered reality was already there, hidden behind the expertly applied makeup and the traumatic awe of her own existence. She didn't feel like a person, she felt like a monument. Her father had spent a decade ensuring she had no friends he didn't approve of, no interests he didn't curate, and no thoughts he hadn't planted. She walked over to her vanity and picked up a small, silver-framed photograph, the only one she was allowed to keep. It showed a younger Daniel and a beautiful, smiling Rebecca on a yacht. Rebecca's eyes were bright, but as Sophie looked closer, she noticed a tension in her mother's smile that she had never seen before. It was the same tension Sophie felt in her own jaw every single day. For years, Sophie had lived in a state of perpetual mourning, fueled by her father's constant reminders of what they had lost. Daniel used his grief like a weapon. Whenever Sophie pushed for more independence, whenever she mentioned wanting to study abroad or move into her own apartment, Daniel would bring up the accident. He would describe the smell of the salt air, the sound of the crashing waves, and the way the light left Rebecca's eyes. He would make Sophie feel as though her desire for a life of her own was a betrayal of her mother's memory. "She gave up everything for us," he would say, his voice thick with a fake, practiced sorrow. "The least we can do is stay together. I can't lose you too, Sophie. You're all I have." It was a masterful form of emotional kidnapping. By making himself the victim, Daniel made Sophie the protector. She stayed because she felt she had to. She wore the blue dresses and attended the silent auctions because she believed her father was a broken man who needed her to be his glue. She didn't realize that the man wasn't broken. He was a master builder, and she was just another brick in his wall. The legend was reinforced at every turn. In the high society circles of New York, Daniel Carter was the gold standard for fatherhood. Other men looked at him with admiration. Other women looked at him with pity. He used the deceased mother narrative to secure massive investments, claiming that his business ventures were all dedicated to the medical research or environmental causes that Rebecca had supposedly loved. He was a man who turned grief into gold, and Sophie was the living proof of his devotion. As the sun began to set on the evening of the gala, Sophie felt a strange, inexplicable sense of dread. She looked out her window at the city skyline, the lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. Tonight was supposed to be her night, the night she officially entered adulthood and took her place by her father's side. But as she watched the shadows grow long across the park, she felt less like a debutante and more like a prisoner being prepared for an execution. She didn't know that miles away, in a darkened hotel room, a woman was checking the frequency on a wireless transmitter. She didn't know that the perfect deceased mother was currently very much alive, her heart beating with a cold, focused desire for vengeance. She didn't know that the golden cage was about to be struck by a lightning bolt of truth that would shatter the bars forever. Sophie took a deep breath, smoothing the pale blue lace of her skirt. She practiced her smile in the mirror, the one that looked like her mother, the one her father liked. She adjusted her pearls, checked her hair, and stepped out of her room to join the man who had stolen her life and told her it was a gift. The gala was waiting, the champagne was on ice, and the lie was 10 years old. But as Sophie walked down the grand staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost was already in the house, watching her from the shadows with eyes that were no longer saintly, but searing. The grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel was a cathedral of deception, draped in white orchids and lit by the cold, unforgiving glow of 1,000 crystal prisms. Every detail of the evening had been engineered by Daniel Carter to serve a dual purpose: to celebrate his daughter's transition into adulthood and to solidify the myth of his own enduring martyrdom. As the staff moved with clinical precision, adjusting silver place settings and polishing the dance floor to a mirror shine, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive lilies, a fragrance Daniel insisted upon because it reminded everyone of a funeral. He didn't just want a party, he wanted a sanctification of his decade-long narrative. By 7:00 p.m., the high-end class signifiers were in full display. The city's power brokers began to arrive, their black limousines forming a funeral-like procession along Fifth Avenue. They came not just to celebrate Sophie, but to pay homage to the great widower. Daniel stood at the entrance, a master of the handshake of sincerity, greeting each guest with a somber smile that suggested he was barely holding his grief at bay for his daughter's sake. To the governors, the CEOs, and the socialites, Daniel was a hero of the heart. To the woman watching from the security monitors in a van parked 3 blocks away, he was a predator in a tuxedo. Behind the scenes, the tension was a physical pressure. Sophie was sequestered in a private suite, her pale blue lace gown spread around her like a fallen cloud. She felt the shattered reality of her life more acutely than ever. Her father had visited her 3 times in the last hour, not to offer a parent's love, but to check her performance markers. He had criticized the way her eyeliner suggested weariness rather than saintly sorrow, and reminded her, for the 100th time, that her mother's memory was the most valuable asset the Carter family possessed. "The press is here, Sophie," Daniel had whispered during his last visit, his fingers digging into the meat of her shoulder. "They're looking for the girl who lost everything and found her strength in her father. Give them that. Don't give them a girl who looks like she wants to be anywhere else." As the ballroom filled, a mysterious benefactor began to make her move. Among the catering staff and the floral designers, a woman moved with the calculated invisibility of someone who had spent 10 years learning how to disappear. She didn't wear the silver silk gown yet. She wore the black vest of a technician, her hair tucked under a cap, a clipboard in her hand. This was Rebecca's opening gambit. She had spent the last 6 months infiltrating the gala's logistics, siphoning off the weapon of truth bit by bit. She had redirected the audio feeds, bypassed the security protocols Daniel had paid a fortune for, and planted her own inception point within the hotel's mainframe. The Gala of Lies was a carefully balanced ecosystem. On one side, there was the public-facing Daniel, the man who used the perfect deceased mother legend to solicit donations for the Rebecca Carter Foundation, a charity that functioned more as a money-laundering vessel for his offshore accounts than a philanthropic endeavor. On the other side was the private Daniel, a man who kept his daughter on a leash so short it was strangling her. The guests, sipping their vintage champagne, were blissfully unaware that they were participants in a massive fraud. They praised Daniel's strength while drinking wine paid for by the inheritance he had stolen from his dead wife. "Is everything ready?" Daniel snapped at his head of security, a man named Miller, as they stood near the stage. "The power cut is synchronized to your toast, sir," Miller replied, his voice low. "Exactly 60 seconds of darkness after you mention the boating accident. It'll give the media the emotional beat they want, and it'll give you time to lead Sophie off the stage before the questions start." Daniel nodded, a smug sense of control washing over him. He loved the theatrics of his own life. He viewed the world as a stage where he was the director, the lead actor, and the only one allowed to see the script. He looked out at the crowd, spotting the power triangle forming early. Sophie was being led to her seat by his assistants, her face a mask of traumatic awe as she took in the sheer scale of the event. She looked small in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the vultures of New York society who were all waiting to see her break. Meanwhile, the benefactor had reached the backstage audiovisual suite. She replaced the technician's cap with a silver headband, her eyes reflecting the glowing monitors. She watched Daniel on the screen. He looked so confident, so untouchable. She felt a surge of smug serenity. She wasn't just here to reveal she was alive. She was here to show Sophie the man behind the curtain. She had documented every legal threat Daniel had used to keep her in exile, every cent he had siphoned from her father's estate, and every lie he had told their daughter. As the clock struck 8:00 p.m., the dinner service began. The clatter of silver against porcelain was the only sound in the room as the lights dimmed for the opening video tribute, a montage of photos showing a young, vibrant Rebecca Carter. The images were grainy, filtered through a nostalgic lens to enhance the tragedy. Sophie watched the screen, her heart aching with a hollow grief she didn't know was manufactured. She saw her mother's smile and felt a pang of guilt for not remembering it more clearly. She didn't know that the woman in the photos was currently standing 50 feet away, watching the same screen with a cold, focused rage. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" a voice whispered near Sophie's ear. Sophie turned to see an older woman, a major donor she didn't recognize, leaning in close. The woman's eyes were sharp, missing the pity that usually defined the looks people gave her. "Your father has done a wonderful job keeping her alive in all of us." "Yes," Sophie managed to say, her throat tight. "He has." "Just remember, Sophie," the woman said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial level. "Sometimes the things we think are buried are just waiting for the right moment to breathe." Before Sophie could ask what she meant, the woman vanished into the bokeh of the crowd. Sophie felt a jolt of electricity run through her. The air in the ballroom felt thinner, more pressurized. She looked at her father, who was laughing with a senator at the head table. For the first time, the golden cage didn't feel like a sanctuary, it felt like a trap that was about to be sprung. The Gala of Lies was reaching its crescendo. The main course was cleared, the speeches were beginning, and the inception point was only minutes away. Daniel stood up, adjusting his custom-tailored tuxedo, preparing his face for the toast of the century. He believed he was about to cement his legacy. He believed that by the end of the night, Sophie would be his forever, bound by the shared tragedy of a mother who never existed. But in the wings, the microphone was being live-tested. The weapon of truth was loaded and aimed. The benefactor stepped out of her technician's gear, the silver silk gown rippling like a warning. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the victor, and as she looked at her husband's back, she knew that the champagne he was about to pour would be the last thing he ever tasted as a free man. The great unmasking was no longer a plan, it was an inevitability. Rebecca Carter stood in the shadows of the service corridor, the cool silk of her silver gown feeling like liquid armor against her skin. For 10 years, she had been a ghost, not the saintly, ethereal spirit Daniel had conjured for his socialite friends, but a woman of flesh and blood who had been forcibly erased from her own life. To the world, she was a tragedy. To Daniel, she was a liability he had successfully liquidated. But as she watched him through the narrow gap in the velvet curtains, she felt the smug serenity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. The Gala of Lies was his masterpiece, but she was about to provide the final, devastating stroke of the brush. Her disappearance had been a masterclass in psychological and legal warfare. 10 years ago, on that rocky coastline in Amalfi, there had been no freak boating accident. There had only been a cold, calculated ultimatum. Daniel had found the evidence of her intent to divorce him, and with it, her plan to take full custody of Sophie and the entirety of her father's shipping fortune. He hadn't reacted with rage. He had reacted with the clinical efficiency of a corporate raider. He had presented her with a choice: disappear quietly with a modest stipend and the promise that Sophie would remain safe, or face a staged accident that would leave Sophie orphaned and the Carter name dragged through the mud of a fabricated scandal. He had spent months preparing the weapon of truth against her, forging documents that suggested she was mentally unstable and a danger to her child. He had isolated her, cut off her access to funds, and whispered into the ears of their friends until her reputation was a sieve. When he finally forced her onto that plane to Salerno, he had told her, "You're dead to this world, Rebecca. If you ever try to claw your way back, I'll make sure Sophie knows exactly how much you hated her." She had spent a decade in the winter of her life, living under an assumed name in a small village in Switzerland. Watching from afar as her husband turned her life into a commodity, she had watched through digital screens as Daniel used her death to solicit millions for his foundations. She had watched as Sophie grew into a woman who wore her mother's favorite colors like a shroud. Every time she saw a photo of her daughter's face, filled with that traumatic awe and shattered reality, Rebecca's resolve hardened into a diamond. She hadn't just survived, she had thrived in the silence. She had rebuilt her own fortune through anonymous investments and gathered a dossier of Daniel's financial crimes that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Her arrival at the Pier Hotel tonight had been the inception point of her revenge. She hadn't just walked through the front door, she had infiltrated the very nervous system of Daniel's empire. Using a visual hacking strategy, she had spent the last 3 hours moving through the hotel as a shadow. She had seen Daniel in the hallway barking orders at his security team, his face a mask of panic and ego even before the first blow was struck. He was a man obsessed with control, which made him blind to the variables he couldn't see. He saw a ballroom, she saw a trap. "Everything is set," a voice whispered in her earpiece. It was the benefactor's contact, a disgruntled former employee of Daniel, who had been more than happy to help facilitate this great unmasking. "The second audio transmitter is live. The House technicians think it's a backup for the senator's speech. Daniel's security won't be able to cut it without shutting down the entire hotel's grid." Rebecca adjusted the silver headband, which concealed a small, high-gain receiver. She looked at her reflection in a tarnished service mirror. The ghost in the lace was gone. In her place was the victor. She had chosen the silver gown specifically for its contrast of control. While Sophie was dressed in the pale blue of a victim and Daniel in the black of a villain, Rebecca would appear as a blinding, metallic streak of truth. She was the resurrection Daniel never saw coming. She moved closer to the stage, the sound of the video tribute drifting through the curtains. She heard the staged sobs of the audience and the hushed, reverent voice of the narrator describing her untimely end. It was a surreal experience, watching your own funeral while standing 5 feet away. She saw Sophie's face on the monitor. The girl looked like she was drowning in the golden cage her father had built. That was the sight that burned away any lingering hesitation. Rebecca wasn't just here for herself. She was here to perform an emergency extraction of her daughter's soul. "Look at him," Rebecca whispered to herself, watching Daniel take the stage for his toast of the century. He looked so polished, his custom tuxedo a suit of armor against the world. He was basking in the high-end class signifiers, believing that his wealth made him invulnerable. He was about to tell the world how much he missed her. He was about to use her name one last time to buy the loyalty of the elite. Rebecca felt the weight of the vintage silver microphone in her hand. It was the weapon of truth that would shatter the background bokeh of this carefully blurred reality. She knew exactly how Daniel's mind worked. He expected a confrontation in a boardroom or a courtroom, somewhere he could use his lawyers to bury the problem. He didn't expect a public ego death in front of the people whose opinions he valued more than his own daughter's happiness. The liquid physics of the evening were in motion. The champagne was being poured, the lights were being dimmed, and the divine spotlight was being calibrated by her own hand. Rebecca took a deep breath, the scent of the lilies filling her lungs. They were meant for her, after all, a funeral for the woman she used to be and a birth for the woman she had become. She stepped onto the service stairs, her heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. She was no longer a memory. She was no longer a ghost trapped in the lace of a dead woman's wardrobe. As Daniel raised his glass to the late Rebecca Carter, the real Rebecca reached out and flipped the switch on her microphone. The security team said it would take exactly 60 seconds to cut the power, she murmured, her voice echoing in her own ears just before it hit the house speakers. But I only need 10. She stepped into the divine spotlight, the silver of her dress catching the volumetric beam until she looked like a star falling into the center of the ballroom. The great unmasking was no longer a plan, it was a reality, and as she looked into the panic and ego death written across Daniel's bulging eyes, she realized that the 10 years of silence had been worth it for this one singular moment of noise. The ghost had taken the microphone, and she was finally ready to speak. The inception point of a lie is rarely a slow crumble. It is a violent, instantaneous fracture. In the grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel, that fracture sounded like a finger tapping against a microphone mesh. To Daniel Carter, it was the sound of a hammer hitting a coffin nail. As he stood center stage, his baccarat glass raised in a final, fraudulent salute to his dead wife, the air in the room didn't just chill, it solidified. The high-end class signifiers that had protected him for a decade, the tuxedo, the vintage bubbles, the reverent silence of the elite, suddenly felt like paper-thin theater props. "Peace is a luxury you never allowed me, Daniel," the voice whispered through the high-fidelity speakers. The liquid physics of the disaster began in Daniel's right hand. At the sound of that rich, melodic contralto, his panic and ego death became a physical reality. His flared fingers, which had just been poised in a gesture of paternal grace, jerked convulsively. The champagne flute tilted. The golden liquid didn't just spill, it erupted from the glass in a glittering spray, drenching the sleeve of his custom-tailored tuxedo. It was the manifestation of a man losing control of his environment in real time. The inception point was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a stain on his sleeve and a scream in his ears. Daniel's expression was a textbook study in catastrophic realization. His mouth, once set in a line of practiced sorrow, fell open into a wide circular void. His eyes bulged, tracking the divine spotlight as it swung away from his face and cut a blinding path toward the right wing of the stage. He looked like a man watching his own execution, unable to blink as the great unmasking unfolded before 500 witnesses. On the left side of the power triangle, Sophie Carter sat frozen. Her pale blue dress, chosen to honor a ghost, now seemed to glow with an eerie, phosphorescent light. She was the picture of shattered reality. Her hand flew to her heart. Her mouth slightly agape as she processed the impossible frequency of the voice. It was a voice she had heard in the echoes of her dreams, a voice her father had told her was silenced by the salt of the Mediterranean. The traumatic awe on her face was so profound that it seemed to blur the background bokeh of the gasping crowd behind her. Then she stepped into the light. Rebecca Carter emerged from the velvet shadows, draped in silver silk that clung to her like liquid mercury. She held the vintage silver microphone, the weapon of truth, with a contrast of control that made Daniel's frantic shaking look even more pathetic. She didn't look like a woman who had drowned. She didn't look like a saint. She looked like a victor who had spent 10 years sharpening her blade in the dark. "Mom!" The word ripped from Sophie's throat, a clarity anchor that shattered the last remains of the gala's artifice. It wasn't a question, it was a recognition of soul. The symmetry and balance of the stage was instantly upended. Sophie didn't look at her father for an explanation. She didn't look at the security guards rushing toward the stage. Her gaze was locked onto the woman in silver, the resurrection that turned her entire childhood into a work of fiction. "I'm not a ghost, Sophie," Rebecca said, her voice steady and echoing through the ballroom. "I'm the mother he told you was dead so he could keep the money you were supposed to inherit. I'm the woman he paid to disappear because I dared to ask for a divorce." Daniel finally found his voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing, a ghost of the command he once held. This is an imposter. Security, remove this woman. She's mentally disturbed." But the power dynamics had already shifted. The security team, led by Miller, hesitated. They looked at the woman in the spotlight, then at their employer, whose face was purple with rage and fear. The smug serenity on Rebecca's face was more convincing than Daniel's frantic orders. She looked like she belonged in that spotlight. He looked like he was trying to hide from it. Go ahead, Daniel, Rebecca challenged, her smirk widening as she stepped closer to the edge of the stage. Tell them about Salerno. Tell them about the offshore accounts in the Swiss Alps. Tell them how you told our daughter I hated her so she wouldn't wonder why I never called. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of hushed whispers and sharp intakes of breath. The high stakes of the scandal were reaching a boiling point. This wasn't a living room argument. This was a public dismantling of a dynasty. Every guest in the room was now a juror, and the verdict was already written in the champagne soaking into Daniel's carpet. Sophie stood up, her legs trembling beneath the pale blue lace. She moved toward the center of the stage, toward the inception point where her father stood crumbling. She looked at the spilling champagne, then at the bulging eyes of the man who had raised her. For the first time in her 21 years, she saw him not as a pillar of strength, but as a hollow shell of vanity and greed. Is it true? Sophie asked, her voice low but carrying over the microphone's sensitivity. Did you lie to me for 10 years? Daniel reached out for her, his fingers flared in a desperate, failed attempt to grasp at his disappearing status. Sophie, sweetheart, she's lying, she's trying to destroy us. Think of the foundation, think of your mother's memory. Her memory is standing right there, Sophie screamed, pointing toward Rebecca. And she's not a memory, she's breathing. The great unmasking was complete. The power triangle had collapsed into a straight line of confrontation. Rebecca stood on the right, the victor holding the microphone. Sophie stood on the left, the victim reclaiming her agency, and Daniel remained in the center, the fall personified. The liquid physics of the evening had reached their final state. The lie was out, the glass was broken, and the inception point had birthed a new, brutal reality. As the first flashbulbs from the press began to pop in the back of the room, Rebecca looked directly into the camera lens. She wasn't just speaking to the ballroom anymore, she was speaking to the world. And Daniel Carter, the man who thought he could own the truth, realized that he was the only one left in the dark. The grand ballroom, usually a place of practiced elegance and whispered pleasantries, had become a vacuum of sound. Every guest was suspended in a state of collective paralysis, their eyes darting between the man shivering in the spotlight and the woman who had just stepped out of a grave. Rebecca Carter did not rush. She understood that silence was her greatest ally. It was the canvas upon which she would paint Daniel's destruction. She adjusted the vintage silver microphone, the weapon of truth, and the hum of the speakers felt like the low growl of a predator. 10 years is a long time to keep a secret, Daniel, Rebecca began, her voice steady, cutting through the stagnant air with the precision of a diamond-tipped blade. But it's an even longer time to live as a ghost. While you were building this monument to your own grief, I was living in a small, windowless apartment in a town whose name you couldn't pronounce, surviving on the scraps of the life you stole from me. Daniel's face had moved past panic into a localized ego death. The liquid physics of his collapse continued as he leaned against the mahogany podium for support, his custom tuxedo now stained not just by champagne, but by the sweat of a man who knew his exit routes were being sealed. He tried to signal his security team again, but Rebecca's contrast of control was absolute. She raised a small, encrypted tablet in her left hand, and the massive projection screens that had previously shown the grainy, nostalgic video of her death suddenly flickered and changed. The great unmasking was no longer just a verbal confrontation, it was a digital execution. Instead of soft-focus photos of a smiling mother, the screens now displayed cold, hard evidence. Bank statements, wire transfer receipts from the Salerno commercial bank, and signed NDAs with signatures that clearly belonged to Daniel Carter. You told the world I died in a boating accident, Rebecca said, her voice rising to fill every corner of the pier. But look at the dates on these transfers, Daniel. This one, dated 3 days after my supposed funeral, shows $5 million moving from my father's trust into a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A company you controlled. A company you used to buy your first seat on the board of Carter International. A gasp moved through the room, a wave of traumatic awe hitting the investors at table 4. These were men who prided themselves on their due diligence, yet they had been charmed by the narrative of the grieving hero. Now, they were seeing the ledger of a thief. I didn't drown, Rebecca continued, stepping closer to Daniel until she was within the power triangle's central zone. I was extorted. You found the drafts of my divorce papers, and you knew that if I left, the shipping fortune stayed with me. You knew that without my father's name, you were just a mid-level manager with a high-end tailor. So you gave me a choice. I could disappear and live, or I could stay and die, in a way that would leave Sophie with a mother whose reputation you would spend years dragging through the mud. Sophie looked up at her mother, her face a canvas of shattered reality. The pale blue lace of her dress felt like a mockery now, a costume for a play she had never auditioned for. You chose to leave, she whispered, her voice cracking the silence. Rebecca's expression softened, the smug serenity momentarily giving way to a raw maternal ache. I chose to keep you safe, Sophie. He told me that if I stayed, he would use his lawyers to declare me unfit. He showed me forged medical records claiming I was a danger to you. He said he would put you in a state-run facility before he let me take you to court. I was one woman against a man who had already bought the judge, the jury, and the police in Salerno. She turned back to Daniel, the weapon of truth aimed directly at his heart. But he made one mistake. He thought money could buy 10 years of silence. He didn't realize that every dollar he spent to keep me away was a dollar I was learning how to track. While he was using my death to solicit donations for a fake foundation, I was working with the forensic accountants he had fired for asking too many questions. The screens changed again, this time. It was a recording, not a video, but an audio file. The room held its breath as a grainy, distorted voice filled the ballroom. She's gone, Miller. The flight to Zurich leaves at midnight. Tell the Italian authorities we found the wreckage of the dinghy, and make sure the press knows how devastated I am. Sophie needs to believe the sea took her. It's cleaner that way. The voice was undeniably Daniel. The inception point of the lie was now laid bare for every governor, senator, and socialite to hear. It was the sound of a man murdering his wife's existence to save his own career. Daniel's panic reached a fever pitch. He lunged for the microphone, his flared fingers clawing at the air, but he tripped on the very podium he had used to elevate himself. He fell to his knees, the power dynamics shifting violently as he looked up at Rebecca from the floor. "You have no proof that recording is real," he shrieked, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, desperate wail. "It's a deepfake. She's an actress. Sophie, don't listen to her." "It's not just a recording, Daniel," Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "It's a confession, and the SEC has been listening to it for the last 48 hours. They've been looking at the Rebecca Carter Foundation's books. They know the money never went to charity. It went to your margins. It went to this party. You're drinking my father's legacy, Daniel, and it's about to turn to vinegar in your mouth." The great unmasking was nearly complete. The high stakes had shifted from a family scandal to a criminal investigation. The background bouquet of the crowd was no longer blurred. The guests were standing up, moving away from Daniel as if his failure were contagious. The high-end class signifiers that had once defined him were now his shackles. Rebecca looked down at the man on his knees. The winner's smirk was back, but it was cold, devoid of joy. This was the justice arc the audience had been waiting for. 10 years of silence, Daniel, and all it took was one microphone to end it. She turned to Sophie and held out her hand. The power triangle was dissolving, leaving only the mother and the daughter in the light. "The cage is open, Sophie. You don't have to wear the blue lace anymore." As Sophie took a trembling step toward her mother, the first sirens could be heard outside the Pier Hotel, their wails cutting through the New York night like the final notes of Daniel Carter's funeral march. The weapon of truth had done its work. The ghost was home, and the king was in the dirt. The ballroom air, once scented with the delicate fragrance of lilies and expensive perfume, now felt thick with the sulfur of a dying reputation. Daniel Carter, once the untouchable sovereign of this social empire, scrambled to his feet, his fingers trembling as he clutched the edge of the mahogany podium. The liquid physics of his downfall continued to manifest. The champagne stain on his tuxedo had spread, dark and ugly, looking like a fresh wound against the starch-white shirt. This was the moment of ego death, but Daniel was not going quietly into the night. Like a cornered animal, he chose the only weapon he had left, the lie itself. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," Daniel's voice cracked, high and frantic, as he grabbed the microphone attached to the podium. "What you are seeing, what you are hearing, it is a masterclass in deception. This woman is a fraud. She is a professional actress hired by my competitors to dismantle the Carter legacy on the very night of my daughter's debut." He turned his gaze toward the power triangle's most vulnerable point, Sophie. His eyes were wide, bulging with a terrifying intensity as he tried to re-establish the shattered reality he had maintained for a decade. "Sophie, look at me, look at her. Does she look like the mother you remember? Look at the eyes. Look at the way she carries herself. It's a trick of lighting and makeup. It's a visual hack designed to exploit your grief." The great unmasking was met with Daniel's desperate attempt at a great gaslighting. He stepped away from the podium, moving toward the center of the stage with a frantic, jerky gait. He looked at the crowd, pleading with the background bouquet of the socialites who were now leaning away from him in disgust. "Think about it," Daniel shouted, his flared fingers pointing accusatorily at Rebecca. "Why now? Why wait 10 years? Because she's been training. She's been studying my wife's mannerisms, her voice, her history. This isn't a resurrection, it's a heist. She's here for the foundation. She's here to steal the very money we use to honor Rebecca's soul." Rebecca didn't flinch. She stood in the divine spotlight, her smug serenity acting as a mirror that reflected Daniel's madness back at him. She held the vintage silver microphone with a contrast of control that made Daniel's screeching sound like static. She was the victor, and he was the fall, and the more he spoke, the deeper he dug his own grave. "Daniel," Rebecca said, her voice a cool, melodic anchor in the storm of his panic. "The guests aren't looking at my face. They're looking at the ledger on the screen. They're looking at the signatures you thought were shredded in Salerno." "Forged," Daniel screamed, the word ripping from his throat. "All of it. You've had years to manufacture paper trail. My lawyers will have you in a cell before the sun comes up. Miller, why are you standing there? Call the police. Tell them we have a trespasser. Tell them an unstable woman has infiltrated a private event and is harassing my daughter." Miller, the head of security, didn't move. He stood at the edge of the stage, his eyes fixed on the weapon of truth projecting on the screens. He had seen the transfer codes. He knew the inception point had passed. Daniel was no longer the man who signed his paychecks. Daniel was a sinking ship, and Miller was a man who knew how to swim. "Miller," Daniel's voice dropped into a hollow, pathetic whisper. The realization that his power dynamics had evaporated was a physical blow. He turned back to the crowd, his panic turning into a frantic, sweating desperation. "Senator, you know me. We played golf on Tuesday. You know the kind of man I am. You saw me at the funeral. You saw me cry." The senator, a man who had used Daniel's widower status to bolster his own family values campaign, slowly stood up. He didn't look at Daniel. He looked at his champagne glass, then placed it firmly on the table and signaled for his wife to get her coat. The exodus had begun. The high-end class signifiers were being withdrawn. Without the approval of the elite, Daniel Carter was nothing more than a man in a wet suit. "Sophie," Daniel pleaded, turning back to his daughter, his voice breaking. "You're the only one who knows the truth. You remember how much I loved her. You remember the nights I spent holding you while you cried. This woman, she's a demon. She's trying to take away the only thing we have left. Don't let her do this to us. Tell them she's not your mother." Sophie stood in the center of the power triangle, her pale blue dress trembling. She looked at the man who had raised her, the man who had curated every thought in her head for 10 years. For a split second, the golden cage almost held. She looked into his bulging, desperate eyes and saw the father she thought she knew. But then she looked at Rebecca. She saw the way the light hit her mother's eyes, the same eyes she saw every morning in her own mirror. "She has the birthmark, Dad," Sophie said, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced Daniel's next lie. "The one you told me was a symbol of her grace. The small, crescent-shaped mark behind her right ear. You told me the sea took it when it took her." Daniel's mouth hung open. His panic and ego death reached its final stage. He had forgotten the one detail he couldn't gaslight. He had forgotten that the shattered reality only works if the victim is blind, and Sophie was finally seeing everything in high definition. "It's over, Daniel," Rebecca said, stepping forward until she was inches from him. The contrast of control was now absolute. She reached out and adjusted his silk tie, a gesture that was both intimate and patronizing. The king has no clothes, and he has no daughter, and in about 30 seconds he's going to have no freedom. The sirens were louder now, the blue and red lights beginning to pulse against the frosted glass of the ballroom's grand windows. The background bouquet of the guests was now a wall of people watching the final act of a tragedy. Daniel looked around the room, his eyes darting like a trapped bird's. He looked for a way out, for a friend, for a lie that would still hold water. But the inception point had flooded the room. "I did it for you," Daniel suddenly bellowed, his voice echoing with a terrifying, delusional conviction. "Everything I did to keep this family together, to build a world worthy of a Carter. If I hadn't made her disappear, we would be nothing. You would be nothing." "I would have been with my mother," Sophie said, stepping away from him and toward Rebecca. "I would have been real." The power dynamics had reached their final resolution. Daniel Carter stood alone in the center of the stage, the fall complete. The champagne was dry, the lie was dead, and the king was nothing more than a man in a ruined tuxedo, waiting for the handcuffs to click. The great unmasking was finished, and as the doors to the ballroom swung open to reveal the authorities, Daniel realized that the only thing louder than Rebecca's microphone was the silence of his own defeat. The red and blue pulses of police cruisers began to strobe against the ballroom's perimeter, but inside the power triangle, time seemed to have frozen. Daniel Carter stood paralyzed, a man whose ego death was now being documented by the very elite he once commanded. The great unmasking had moved beyond the shock of the physical reveal. It had entered the cold, clinical phase of the paper trail. Rebecca Carter, still bathed in the cool-toned, divine spotlight, reached into a slim, brushed steel briefcase she had retrieved from the speaker's podium. "You always said our mother died because she was reckless, Dad," Sophie said, her voice trembling but finding a new, jagged edge. She moved away from Daniel, the pale blue lace of her dress fluttering like the wings of a bird finally leaving its golden cage. She stepped toward Rebecca, gravitating toward the position of power. "You told me the sea was her only witness, but it looks like she brought her own." Rebecca didn't speak. Instead, she handed Sophie a thick, translucent folder. It wasn't filled with grainy photos or sentimental letters. It was filled with the weapon of truth, in its most lethal form, data. As Sophie opened it, the massive projection screens behind them flickered to life again, displaying high-resolution scans of documents that had supposedly been burned in a furnace in Salerno 10 years prior. "The inception point of your father's empire wasn't hard work or visionary leadership, Sophie," Rebecca said, her voice amplified by the vintage silver microphone. "It was a series of wire transfers executed while I was being held in a private clinic under a name that wasn't mine. Look at the signature on page 4. Sophie's eyes scanned the document. It was a power of attorney form, granting Daniel Carter total control over the Fairchild family estate, Rebecca's maiden fortune. The signature at the bottom was a shaky, distorted version of her mother's handwriting, but beneath it, in a small, time-stamped digital watermark, was the proof of the visual hacking Daniel had utilized to secure his throne. "The timestamp is from August 14th, 2016, Sophie whispered, the shattered reality of her life finally coming into sharp focus. "That was 2 weeks after the memorial service. You signed this, while the world thought you were at the bottom of the Mediterranean." "I didn't sign it," Rebecca corrected, her gaze fixed on Daniel, who was now clutching his chest, his panic reaching a state of near syncope. "A woman named Elena Rossi signed it. A nurse Daniel paid $2 million to act as my surrogate in a law office in Naples. If you turn to the next page, you'll see the death certificate for Elena Rossi. She died in a car accident 3 months later. Your father is very thorough when it comes to closing loops." A collective gasp rippled through the background bouquet of the crowd. This was no longer a family drama. It was a homicide investigation in the making. The high-end class signifiers that Daniel had cultivated, the custom tuxedo, the vintage champagne, the prestigious gala, were now the very things that made his crimes look more grotesque. He had built a skyscraper of lies on a foundation of blood and forgery. "Everything," Sophie said, looking back at her father with a look of traumatic awe that had curdled into pure, unadulterated disgust. "Every birthday present, every tuition payment, every piece of jewelry you bought me. It was all bought with the money you stole from the mother you told me I'd never see again." Daniel tried to speak, but the words were caught in the dry, chalky void of his throat. His flared fingers reached out, grasping at the air as if he could pluck the documents from the screen and swallow them. It was a partnership, Sophie. Your mother wasn't well. She was going to ruin us. I saved the legacy. The legacy of what, Daniel? Rebecca's voice sliced through his gasping defense. The legacy of the Rebecca Carter Foundation. Let's show the room where that money actually went. With a swipe of her tablet, the divine spotlight of truth shifted to a complex flowchart of offshore accounts. The guests, many of whom were major donors to the foundation, leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the damning glow of the paper trail. The liquid physics of the revelation was unstoppable now. The flowchart showed millions of dollars meant for maternal health in the Mediterranean being diverted into a shell company that funded Daniel's private jet, his penthouse renovations, and the very gala they were currently standing in. You didn't just kill her memory, Sophie said, her voice rising to a scream as she threw the folder at her father's feet. The papers scattered across the marble, white petals of truth falling on a man made of mud. You turned her into a brand. You sold her death to the highest bidder. Daniel collapsed to his knees, his ego death complete. He looked down at the papers, the bank statements, the forged signatures, the photos of the Italian clinic. The symmetry and balance of the stage was gone. He was a small, broken man surrounded by the debris of his own deception. The champagne stain on his tuxedo looked like a black hole, sucking in the last of his dignity. I have the original ledger, Sophie, Rebecca said, stepping forward to bridge the gap between her and her daughter. She placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, a gesture of smug serenity that was finally shared. And I have the witnesses. Elena Rossi's sister has been waiting 10 years to tell her story. The weapon of truth isn't just a metaphor, it's a prison sentence. The doors at the back of the ballroom finally burst open. Not just the hotel security, but federal agents in dark windbreakers, their boots thudding against the polished floor. The high stakes had reached their final resolution. The power triangle had served its purpose. Rebecca was the victor, Sophie was the rescued, and Daniel was the fall. As the agents moved toward the stage, Daniel looked up at the divine spotlight. For a second, he looked as though he might try to explain it all away one last time, to find a lie that could bridge the gap between the man he was and the monster he had become. But then he looked at Sophie, who was leaning into her mother's side, her face no longer shattered, but set in a mask of cold, hard justice. Take him, Sophie whispered, her voice a clarity anchor that signaled the end of the Carter dynasty. The paper trail had led them exactly where it needed to go. The ghost had returned, the truth had been spoken, and as the handcuffs clicked shut over Daniel's wrists, the only thing left of the toast of the century was the smell of spilled champagne and the silence of a girl who finally knew her mother was alive. The air in the grand ballroom had reached a state of terminal pressure. As the federal agents bypassed the frozen catering staff and the retreating socialites, the stage became an isolated island of psychological warfare. This was the power triangle in its most volatile form, Daniel shattered and kneeling in the center, Rebecca radiant and unyielding on the right, and Sophie, the emotional pivot point, standing on the left. The great unmasking had stripped away the glamour of the evening, leaving only the raw, jagged bones of a family built on a graveyard of secrets. Daniel looked up from the floor, his panic and ego death manifesting as a desperate sweating mask. He reached out with a trembling hand, his flared fingers catching the hem of Sophie's pale blue lace gown. "Sophie, please," he croaked, his voice stripped of its practiced resonance. "Look at me, look at your father. I am the one who held you through every nightmare. I am the one who cheered at your graduation. This woman, she is a stranger to you. She chose to stay away. If she loved you, she would have fought through 1,000 lawyers to get back to you. She stayed in the shadows because she liked the silence." The liquid physics of the scene shifted as Sophie looked down at her father's hand. For a decade, that hand had represented safety, authority, and the only link she had to a vanished past. Now it looked like a shackle. She felt the shattered reality of her entire existence vibrating in her chest. Every memory of her father's strength was now being reprocessed as a calculated move in a long-term con. She didn't stay away because she wanted to, Dad, Sophie said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that silenced his pleading. She pulled the lace of her dress out of his grip with a sharp, decisive snap. She stayed away because you held a knife to her throat and told her it was for my own good. You didn't protect me from the tragedy. You were the tragedy. Rebecca stepped forward, entering the central zone of the power triangle. She didn't look at Daniel with rage. She looked at him with the smug serenity of a mathematician who had finally solved an impossible equation. She held the vintage silver microphone, the weapon of truth, down at her side, her voice now projecting naturally through the silent room. The choice isn't between a mother and a father, Sophie, Rebecca said, her eyes locked onto her daughter, with a contrast of control that anchored the room. The choice is between the lie that kept you small and the truth that makes you whole. He didn't raise you, Sophie. He curated you. He turned you into a living monument to a crime he committed every single day he looked you in the eye and told you I was dead. Daniel lunged forward, not toward Rebecca, but toward Sophie's feet, a pathetic display of catastrophic realization. I can fix this. We can leave tonight. We'll take the jet to the island. We'll start over. The Carter name still means something. I did it all for you, Sophie. Every penny, every lie, it was to ensure you never had to feel the cold of the world. The only cold I've ever felt was in this house, Sophie spat, the words acting as a clarity anchor for the gathered witnesses. She looked at the federal agents, who were now only feet away, their badges gleaming under the divine spotlight. She then looked back at Rebecca. The symmetry and balance of her life was shifting toward the mother she had lost. You told me she drowned, Sophie whispered to Daniel, her face a mask of cold, hard justice. You made me visit a cenotaph in Italy every summer. You watched me cry over an empty grave while you were checking your bank balances. Did you ever feel anything? When you looked at me and saw her eyes, did you ever feel a single second of regret? Daniel's mouth worked soundlessly, his circular mouth a void of failed excuses. He looked at the paper trails scattered across the floor, the forged signatures, the wire transfers, the photos of the Italian clinic. The high stakes had reached their breaking point. There was no lie left in his arsenal that could bridge the gap between his daughter and his greed. He felt nothing but the weight of his own wallet, Rebecca said, her voice cutting through Daniel's silence. She reached out and took Sophie's hand. The contact was electric, a physical inception point that bridged 10 years of forced separation. He used your grief as a shield, Sophie. He knew that as long as you were mourning me, you would never look too closely at him. He didn't love you, he owned you. Sophie, don't do this, Daniel wailed, his voice cracking as the first federal agent placed a firm hand on his shoulder. If you walk away with her, you're dead to the world. You'll lose everything. The penthouse, the accounts, the status, it's all tied to the Carter name. Without me, you're just the daughter of a ghost and a criminal. Sophie looked at her father, then at the agents who were pulling him to his feet. She saw the panic and ego death in his eyes and realized that the high-end class signifiers he was clinging to were the bars of his own making. She looked at the pale blue lace of her sleeves, the color of a lie, and then at the silver silk of her mother's gown, the color of the truth. I'd rather be the daughter of a ghost than the accomplice of a monster, Sophie said, her voice ringing out with a finality that signaled the end of the power triangle. She turned her back on Daniel as the agents began to lead him away. The liquid physics of the evening reached their conclusion. The champagne was dry, the glass was shattered, and the inception point had birthed a new reality. Sophie didn't look back as her father began to scream her name, a desperate, hollow sound that was quickly swallowed by the cavernous ballroom. Rebecca pulled Sophie into a tight embrace, the silver silk of her gown reflecting the divine spotlight until they both seemed to be made of light. The great unmasking was over. The position of power had been reclaimed. I've got you, Rebecca whispered into Sophie's hair. The 10 years of silence are over. We're going to build something real now. As the ballroom began to clear and the sirens outside faded into the distance, Sophie realized that the golden cage hadn't just been broken, it had been dismantled. She stood with her mother in the center of the ruins of her father's empire, finally breathing air that wasn't filtered through a lie. The power triangle had dissolved into a partnership, and for the first time in 21 years, Sophie Carter knew exactly who she was. The heavy brass doors of the Pier Hotel ballroom swung shut with a sound that resembled the falling of a guillotine. Outside, the New York night was a frenzy of strobing sirens and flashbulbs, but inside, the silence was absolute. The high-end class signifiers that had defined the evening, the $5,000 a plate dinners, the vintage champagne, and the shimmering lace, now felt like the debris of a shipwreck. Daniel Carter was gone. He had been led away in handcuffs, his panic and ego death finally complete as he was forced into the back of a black sedan, his custom tuxedo bunched and ruined under the grip of federal agents. The king was unmasked, and the kingdom he had built on a foundation of shattered reality had vanished in the span of a single toast. Sophie stood in the center of the vacated stage, her gaze fixed on the spot where her father had knelt only moments ago. The liquid physics of the night had reached a standstill. The spilled champagne had dried into a sticky, dark stain on the marble, a permanent marker of the moment the lie broke. She felt a strange, hollow lightness in her chest, the sensation of a bird that had spent its entire life in a golden cage and was suddenly told the sky was hers. She looked down at her hands, still trembling, and then at the pale blue lace of her gown. It felt heavy now, a costume for a play that had finally closed its doors. "It's over, Sophie," Rebecca said, her voice a calm, melodic anchor in the wreckage. She stepped toward her daughter, the silver silk of her gown reflecting the dimming house lights. The divine spotlight had been turned off, but Rebecca seemed to carry her own light now, a smug serenity that had matured into something deeper, something maternal. "The silence is over. The paper trail has been handed to the district attorney. He will never touch us again." Sophie looked at her mother, the woman who had been a ghost, a saint, and a tragedy, and was now finally a person. "What do we do now?" she whispered. The traumatic awe of the revelation was fading, replaced by the daunting, shattered reality of a future without a script. "He took 10 years, Mom. He took everything I thought was true. How do we even begin to build something real out of this?" "We start by leaving this room," Rebecca replied, reaching out to take Sophie's hand. The position of power had shifted from a weapon of revenge to a hand of support. "And then, we start by remembering, not the version of me he sold to the world, but the version of us that he couldn't kill." The slow process of rebuilding a real life began that very night, far from the cameras and the background bouquet of New York high society. They retreated to a quiet townhouse Rebecca had acquired under her assumed name, a space that was the antithesis of the Carter estate. There were no high-end class signifiers here, no museum-quality galleries of grief. There was only the symmetry and balance of a home designed for living, not for performance. In the weeks that followed, the great unmasking played out across every headline in the country. The weapon of truth Rebecca had brought to the gala proved to be an unstoppable force. Daniel's legal team tried to mount a defense, attempting to gaslight the public one last time by claiming temporary insanity or protective custody, but the forensic accounting was too precise. The wire transfers, the forged signatures in Salerno, and the testimony of the nurse's sister formed a paper trail that led directly to a federal prison. Daniel Carter, the man who thought he could own the truth, was sentenced to 25 years for fraud, extortion, and the psychological kidnapping of his own daughter. For Sophie, the transformation was slower and more painful. She had to dismantle the golden cage piece by piece. She spent hours talking with Rebecca, learning about the mother she had lost, not the saint who loved blue lace, but the woman who loved jazz, hated the heat, and had once dreamed of being a photographer. They sat in the kitchen of the townhouse, the inception point of their new relationship, surrounded by old photo albums that Daniel hadn't been able to burn. "He told me you hated the sea," Sophie said one afternoon, looking at a photo of a young Rebecca diving into the waves. "I loved the sea," Rebecca said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He told you that because the sea was where he tried to bury me, he needed you to fear the very thing that made me feel free." The contrast of control was no longer between Rebecca and Daniel. It was between Sophie's past and her future. She stopped wearing the pale blue gowns. She cut her hair, and she began the process of reclaiming the Fairchild fortune, not to build a new empire, but to fund the very causes Daniel had used as a front. She turned the Rebecca Carter Foundation into a real organization, one that specialized in legal aid for women facing the same kind of systemic abuse and visual hacking She and her mother had survived. The power dynamics of their lives had finally reached a state of health. Sophie was no longer the victim on the left. She was a partner in her own destiny. Rebecca was no longer the victor seeking revenge. She was a mother seeking reconciliation. They traveled back to Italy, not to the rocky coastline of Salerno, but to a small, quiet village where they could walk along the shore without the weight of a lie pressing down on them. As they stood on the sand, the Mediterranean sun casting a divine light over the water, Sophie felt the last of the traumatic awe leave her body. She looked at her mother, who was adjusting a camera lens, capturing the horizon. The great unmasking was truly finished. The ghost had become a woman, the prisoner had become a daughter. And the king was a footnote in a history book of crimes. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked, noticing Sophie's long silence. Sophie took a deep breath, the salt air filling her lungs, the air her father had told her would drown her. She looked out at the infinite blue, then back at the woman she had once mourned. "I'm more than okay," Sophie said, her voice clear and resonant, no longer a whisper in a golden cage. "I'm finally awake." The unmasking was not just about revealing the villain, it was about revealing the life that was left behind. And as the waves lapped at their feet, Sophie and Rebecca Carter turned away from the ruins of the past and began the long, beautiful walk toward a reality that belonged only to them. The story concludes with the total dismantling of Daniel Carter's fraudulent empire and his sentencing to 25 years in federal prison. Justice is served not just in a courtroom, but in the emotional reclamation of Sophie's life. The power triangle is permanently dissolved as Sophie sheds the pale blue lace of her father's curation and embraces a future defined by her own choices, leaning on the partnership of a mother who was resurrected by the truth. The narrator highlights that no lie is large enough to bury the truth forever, and no golden cage is strong enough to hold a spirit determined to be free. The story serves as a reminder that the very weapon of truth used to destroy a villain can become the foundation for a victim's new life. It emphasizes that while karma may take a decade to arrive, it speaks with a microphone that the whole world can hear. If you were satisfied to see Daniel Carter trade his custom tuxedo for a prison jumpsuit, give this video a thumbs up. Do you think 10 years was too long to wait for justice, or was the wait worth the ultimate unmasking? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss another tale of high-stakes justice and the triumph of the truth.